The morning was like any other. Sarah woke up to the sound of her alarm clock ringing, signaling the start of another busy day. She rolled over, squinting at the clock on her nightstand. It was barely 6, just enough time to get a cup of coffee before the kids stirred and demanded her attention. With a sigh, she swung her legs off the bed, her feet hitting the cool wooden floor. The silence of the early morning was her time to gather her thoughts before the rush of responsibilities began. She glanced over at Tom, still asleep beside her, the faint outline of his form barely visible under the covers. They had grown used to the distance between them over the years, though they hadn't yet spoken about it. Their marriage was no longer a partnership. It was a routine they both endured. As she got ready for the day, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of dread in her chest. The divorce papers had been filed weeks ago, but the finality of it still hadn't sunk in. The decision to part ways with Tom hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. Their relationship had slowly deteriorated, worn thin by years of silent disagreements, unspoken resentments, and emotional neglect. The love they once shared had faded into something less tangible, leaving behind only the remnants of familiarity and routine. But this morning, as she moved through the motions of preparing breakfast for their 2 kids, Sophie and Jake, Sarah's mind was not on the divorce. Her thoughts were consumed by the usual concerns: work, school, the kids' schedules, things that always took precedence. She was used to juggling it all, though the weight of it often felt heavier now that the marriage was ending. Still, there was a sense of relief mixed with guilt. It was strange how those emotions could coexist, but it had been a long time since she had felt truly content in her relationship with Tom. The mail came as it always did around 10 o'clock a.m. Sarah had a habit of sorting through it quickly, sifting out the bills and junk. But today, a single envelope caught her eye. It wasn't from her lawyer or any of the usual sources. It was a letter from the court. Her heart skipped a beat as she tore it open, expecting some sort of final confirmation about the divorce, something routine. But the words on the page were anything but routine. They were a shock to her system. It said she was ordered to pay child support to Tom. The words blurred as she read them again, her mind struggling to process what they meant. Sarah had assumed the custody arrangement would be simple. They would share the kids, divide responsibilities equally. But this was something entirely different. There had to be some mistake. She wasn't the one who had been the primary caregiver. Tom had always been there for the kids when she couldn't be. But this felt like a cruel twist of fate. Her hand shook as she dialed Tom's number. He answered after a few rings, his voice groggy from sleep. "What's wrong?" he asked, sounding as though he had just woken up. She could hear the faint hum of the television in the background, the kids' laughter echoing as they played together. "It's the court," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "They've ruled. I have to pay you child support." "What is this? I don't understand." She tried to keep her voice steady, but the shock and disbelief were starting to seep through. How could this happen? It didn't make sense. She had always assumed Tom would have a more prominent role in raising the children, and she would provide what she could. But this was an entirely new burden. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Tom spoke. "I don't know, Sarah," he said slowly. "I didn't ask for this." He sounded strangely detached, almost as if he was speaking about someone else's life, not their own. "The court made their decision, and we just have to live with it." Her stomach twisted as she processed his words. Sarah had expected Tom to offer some kind of reassurance, some acknowledgement of how impossible this situation felt, but instead he sounded resigned, almost indifferent. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and for a moment she was unsure of what to do next. The reality of the situation had not fully hit her until now. Divorce wasn't just about moving on from a broken relationship. It was about navigating an entirely new financial landscape. And this was a complication she hadn't seen coming. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself caught in a storm of confusion and anger. She had already made sacrifices for her family over the years, putting her career on the back burner to care for the kids, putting her own dreams aside to keep the peace at home. But now it felt like a punch to the gut, as though everything she had done for them had been rendered meaningless in the eyes of the law. She wasn't prepared for this kind of outcome. She had expected something, but never this. The shock lingered as she went through the motions of the day, taking the kids to school, returning to an office full of demands, trying to act like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. It was as though she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss of uncertainty. She had never imagined that divorce could lead to this, paying child support to the very person she had worked so hard to separate herself from. This was the unexpected consequence of trying to escape a marriage that had long since lost its meaning. By the time the day came to an end, Sarah was physically exhausted but mentally drained. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, trying to find a way to make sense of it all. Why hadn't anyone warned her that divorce could lead to something like this? She thought back to the conversations with her lawyer, with Tom, with her friends, all of them so focused on the custody arrangements and the division of property. No one had mentioned this. She felt blindsided, and the weight of that feeling settled heavily in her chest. As she tucked her children into bed that night, she couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread that had taken root in her mind. It was clear now that her life, once so predictable, had been forever altered by this simple court order. What had once been a distant thought in her mind, paying child support, had become an immediate reality, one that she wasn't prepared for. And as she stared out the window into the darkening sky, Sarah knew that everything was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. The next steps would be difficult, uncertain, and full of challenges she had never anticipated. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the court order still clutched in her hands. It felt like a cruel joke, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her mind swirled with questions. How had things gotten to this point? When had everything started to go wrong? Her relationship with Tom had always been a slow burn, a gradual wearing down of love and respect that, in the end, didn't leave much of a marriage to salvage. But even in the midst of all that, she never imagined it would lead to this. Facing the reality of paying child support to her ex-husband, she tried to recall the early days of their marriage. It had been simple, full of hope and promise. They were both young, excited about building a life together. Tom was charming, funny, and supportive. They were a team back then. The first few years were blissful. They both worked full-time, splitting the household chores and enjoying weekends together. But after Sophie was born, things started to shift. Tom's hours at work increased, and Sarah, having always wanted to be a mother, decided to cut back on her career to stay home and raise the kids. At first, it seemed like the right decision. They could manage on one income, and Tom was there to support them. But as the years passed, something began to change. Tom's job kept him busy, and as he climbed the corporate ladder, he became more distant. Sarah didn't mind at first. After all, he was doing it for the family. But over time, the distance between them became more than just physical. Emotional gaps began to form. Tom became less interested in the details of their daily life. He didn't ask how she was doing or check in on her as much. His conversations were brief, surface level. Sarah, on the other hand, was managing everything at home. She was the one juggling the kids' school schedules, doctor's appointments, and the never-ending to-do lists. The weight of it all began to wear on her. She felt lonely in her own home. As the years wore on, their communication faltered. Arguments became more frequent, and the small things that once brought them joy seemed to irritate them both. Sarah began to feel like she was invisible in her own marriage, and Tom seemed to retreat further into his work. They both carried their frustrations quietly, never addressing the deeper issues that lay beneath the surface. It wasn't until they had their second child, Jake, that Sarah started to realize how distant they had truly become. Their lives had become routines, not partnerships. They were merely coexisting, not living as a married couple. By the time they filed for divorce, Sarah was exhausted. The emotional weight of the years had drained her, and she no longer knew who the person lying beside her at night even was. Tom was a good father, but she felt disconnected from him in ways she couldn't explain. The decision to separate wasn't easy, but it felt like the only option left. They both agreed on shared custody, which seemed like the fairest arrangement at the time. They would both take turns caring for the kids, managing their lives separately but still sharing the responsibility of raising their children. But the reality of what that would mean in terms of child support never occurred to Sarah. The letter from the court had thrown everything into turmoil. She had thought the divorce would be a clean break, a fresh start. Instead, it felt like a financial burden that she wasn't prepared for. As the days passed after receiving the letter, Sarah began to question everything. She had always been the one who stayed home with the kids, the one who had sacrificed her career and personal time for their family. Now she was being asked to pay for her children's care in a way that felt both unjust and overwhelming. How could this be happening? Had she made the wrong choice in trusting the system? The divorce proceedings had been relatively civil, or so she had thought. She and Tom had sat down with their lawyers and agreed on the basic terms. Custody was shared, and they decided they would work together for the benefit of the children. Sarah hadn't expected things to go beyond that. She was focused on making sure the kids were taken care of and didn't fully understand the complex financial dynamics involved in child support. Tom, on the other hand, seemed to have his own agenda, though he had kept it hidden during the discussions. Now it became clear that the child support ruling was not just about caring for the kids. It was about something more. It was about money, and how that would be divided between them in a way neither of them had anticipated. The first call Sarah made was to her lawyer. She needed answers, but when the conversation ended, she felt even more confused than before. Her lawyer explained that the child support laws in their state were complex, and there were many factors involved. One of those factors was income, and despite Sarah's best efforts to provide for her family, her income was lower than Tom's. She had put her career on hold to be a mother, and now it was as though that choice was coming back to haunt her. The more she learned, the more she realized how little she had understood about the financial aspects of their divorce. Tom's lawyer had argued that Sarah's earnings were sufficient enough to contribute to the children's upbringing. Meanwhile, Tom had been carefully planning his finances, though he had always seemed like the underdog in their marriage, working long hours and often out of the house. He had been slowly building his savings, investing in a business, and making financial moves that put him in a better position. Sarah hadn't seen it. She had been too focused on the day-to-day struggles of raising their children, while Tom had quietly set himself up for this moment. It felt like a betrayal, and the pain of realizing how much she had been blindsided by it was overwhelming. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's emotions began to fluctuate. Anger, confusion, frustration. It was all there. She had never wanted to be in this situation. She had never wanted to be fighting for her children in a courtroom, struggling to find a way to make ends meet, while Tom seemed so unaffected by the whole ordeal. Every time she looked at the court order, she felt like it was a slap in the face. How had she gotten here? How had everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, led to this moment of financial and emotional instability? Her friends and family were supportive, but their responses were mixed. Some believed that the court's decision was fair, that Tom deserved the support for the children he was raising just as much as Sarah did. Others, however, expressed disbelief that she would be in this position at all, considering her years of commitment to the family. Sarah couldn't even bring herself to tell them how she truly felt, betrayed, overwhelmed, and unsure of what to do next. They didn't understand how deeply this situation had affected her. As the days went by, Sarah started to realize that her life was at a crossroads. She had always been able to handle things on her own, to carry the weight of her family's needs without much complaint. But this was different. The decisions made now would shape the rest of her life, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to carry it all. She needed answers, but more than anything, she needed a way out of this nightmare. The letter from the court had cracked open a door to a reality she had never seen coming, And now Sarah had no choice but to walk through it. The next step would be the hardest of all, facing the full extent of the consequences and trying to find a way to rebuild her life, knowing that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and emotional upheaval. The unexpected twists had only just begun. The days after receiving the court's letter felt like an endless blur to Sarah. Each moment stretched into the next as she grappled with the overwhelming sense of disbelief and confusion that had taken over her life. She couldn't stop replaying the situation in her mind, wondering where things had gone wrong. She had spent so many years trying to be the best mother she could be, sacrificing so much of herself in the process. The thought of paying child support to Tom, of all people, felt like an unfair punishment. She had never anticipated it, never imagined the end of her marriage would come with such a financial burden. She had done everything right, hadn't she? Raised the kids, taken care of the house, put her career on hold for them. And now this. But as the shock slowly wore off, something else began to settle in. A deep, burning anger that she could no longer ignore. Sarah's initial reaction to the court's ruling had been to feel small, helpless, even embarrassed. But as time passed, she realized that she had to fight back. She had to understand how this had happened, why it had happened, and what her options were moving forward. The first thing she did was consult with her lawyer again. She needed clarity. She needed to know if there was any way to reverse the ruling or at least reduce the financial burden. The lawyer's office was quiet, almost sterile, and Sarah sat across from him, feeling smaller than ever. He explained that the child support ruling was final for now, but that there were avenues for modification if her circumstances changed. However, that wasn't a guarantee. It was going to be a long, expensive process, and the truth was, Sarah didn't have the money to keep fighting. The lawyer seemed to understand that, offering some advice on how to manage her current situation, but nothing could erase the weight of what was happening. She was being forced into a position she had never imagined, at the mercy of a system that didn't seem to understand her side of the story. But what truly struck Sarah in that meeting was when her lawyer mentioned the financial strategies Tom had employed throughout their marriage. It wasn't just that he had a higher income now, it was how he had hidden it, how he had set himself up for this moment. Tom had always been good at playing the long game. He had invested in a business that was slowly gaining traction, and he had built a portfolio of assets that gave him more financial security than she had realized. All of this, unbeknownst to her, while she had focused on raising their children, keeping the household afloat, and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Sarah had trusted him, and yet he had kept his financial dealings secret. That realization stung more than anything else. The anger grew. She wasn't just angry at the court or at the system. She was angry at Tom. She had given him the benefit of the doubt, assuming that, like most divorced parents, they would be able to coexist and raise their children without the financial strain or resentment. But now she understood that Tom had planned his financial future for this very moment. While Sarah had been doing everything in her power to be there for their family, he had been quietly building a financial safety net that gave him leverage over her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her first instinct was to confront him, to demand answers. But when Sarah showed up at Tom's house, it became clear that this was not going to be a simple conversation. Sarah's life felt like it had become a tangled web of court dates, legal battles, and emotional exhaustion. Despite her best efforts to stay focused on her children and the future she hoped to build for them, every waking moment seemed to pull her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't escape. The child support battle loomed over her, and the more she tried to move forward, the more it felt as if the past was weighing her down. Each conversation, each legal brief, each reminder of the situation brought her closer to the edge. She couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that no matter how hard she fought, she was destined to lose. But as her legal battles continued, a new opportunity, an unexpected twist, emerged. Sarah's lawyer had suggested that if she wanted a chance to reduce the financial burden, she would need to dig deeper into Tom's financial dealings. At first, Sarah had dismissed it. It seemed like such a tedious, daunting task, one she didn't know how to approach. But as the weeks dragged on and her bills piled up, she realized that this might be her only chance to gain some semblance of control over the situation. She started looking into Tom's business, his investments, and his finances, hoping to find something, anything, that would show that his income was higher than he had let on during the divorce negotiations. The deeper Sarah dug, the more she discovered. Tom had been smarter than she had given him credit for. He had invested in real estate and stocks over the years, accumulating wealth in ways Sarah had never known about. It was almost as if he had been planning this all along. As she pieced together the puzzle, Sarah's frustration reached new heights. How could he have hidden all of this from her? How had he managed to build such a comfortable financial cushion while she struggled to make ends meet? It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything else. The more she uncovered, the more she realized just how much of the financial burden was placed on her shoulders, while Tom had been quietly setting himself up for this moment. Armed with this new information, Sarah returned to her lawyer's office, feeling a spark of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. She laid out her findings, and her lawyer's reaction confirmed what she had hoped for, a glimmer of a chance to modify the child support ruling. Tom's hidden assets, coupled with the disparity in their incomes, could potentially change the course of the case. However, there was still no guarantee. The legal system, as Sarah was quickly learning, was a maze of complexities, and even the most promising evidence could be challenged or disregarded. But for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she had a fighting chance. The next step was to go back to court, to present this new evidence and hope for a favorable outcome. But the closer the court date came, the more anxiety built within her. She knew this wasn't just a battle for money. It was about proving herself. It was about showing Tom, and everyone involved, that she wasn't going to roll over and accept a situation that wasn't fair. It was about her dignity. She couldn't help but feel a deep, unsettling sense of fear, the kind that only comes from knowing that a single decision could alter the trajectory of your life forever. Sarah had never been one to back down, but this was different. This wasn't just a legal case, it was her life. The morning of the hearing arrived, and Sarah found herself standing in front of the courthouse, heart pounding, unsure of what to expect. Tom was already inside, sitting with his lawyer, looking calm and composed, his usual air of detachment apparent. Sarah, on the other hand, felt every inch of the weight of the situation. She had rehearsed her arguments over and over in her mind, but now that she was here, they didn't seem to matter. All that mattered was whether or not the judge would believe her, whether or not she would be able to convince the court that the current child support ruling was not in the best interests of her children or her future. As Sarah entered the courtroom, she felt a surge of emotion. The room was cold, sterile, everything she had imagined it would be. She sat down at her lawyer's side, the table between them feeling like a barricade. Tom sat across from her, not even glancing her way, his lawyer speaking quietly to him. For a moment, Sarah wished she could have just walked out. The tension in the air was suffocating, but there was no turning back now. She was here, and she had to face it. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He was an older man, his face stern and unmoving. Sarah had heard that he was known for being tough, and as he addressed the court, it became clear that he wasn't going to make any decisions without a thorough examination of the facts. The hearing began, and Sarah listened carefully as her lawyer outlined their case, presenting the new evidence about Tom's hidden assets. Sarah's heart raced as she heard her lawyer's voice grow steadier, more confident as he described how Tom's wealth had been misrepresented in the initial divorce settlement. Tom's lawyer fought back fiercely, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial and arguing that Sarah was simply trying to avoid her responsibilities. The words stung, but Sarah refused to let them break her. She knew the truth, and she wasn't going to let Tom manipulate the situation any longer. But as the proceedings dragged on, Sarah could feel the pressure mounting. Every question from the judge, every objection from Tom's lawyer, felt like a personal attack. She had spent so many months trying to hold everything together, And now it was all on the line. Would the court side with her? Or would Tom walk away with even more than he had bargained for? Finally, after hours of testimony, the judge called for a recess. Sarah's stomach churned as she sat in the cold, empty courtroom, waiting for the final decision. She couldn't stop her mind from racing, from wondering how everything would turn out. There were so many unknowns, so many variables, and all she could do was wait. She thought about Sophie and Jake, about what kind of future she wanted for them. She thought about the sacrifices she had made, the pain she had endured, and wondered if it would all be enough to tip the scales in her favor. When the judge finally returned, his expression was unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable as he spoke, addressing both sides. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest as she braced herself for what was to come. And then, finally, the words came. The judge acknowledged the evidence Sarah had presented and the discrepancies in Tom's financial situation. He ruled that the child support order would be adjusted to reflect a more balanced distribution of financial responsibility, taking into account Tom's hidden assets and increased income. It wasn't a full victory, but it was enough. A relief that felt like a heavy weight lifting off her shoulders. As Sarah left the courtroom, her mind was spinning. The outcome had been a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe, to acknowledge that she had fought back and won, even if only in part. The road ahead was still long, but Sarah now knew that she was stronger than she had ever realized. The emotional toll had been immense, but it had also revealed something crucial: her resilience, her determination to protect her children, and her refusal to let the system dictate her future. As she walked out into the sunlight, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The battle wasn't over, but for now, she had taken a stand, and that was enough. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had felt such a sense of exhaustion and relief at the same time. The days after the court ruling were a blur of mixed emotions. On the one hand, she had won a small victory, but on the other hand, she knew that the fight wasn't over. The decision had given her some breathing room, but the financial burden was still looming large. Child support payments were going to be a constant reminder of how much had changed in her life, how different her future looked compared to the one she had envisioned when she and Tom first got married. But now, Sarah had something she hadn't had in months: hope. Hope that things could get better, hope that she could regain control of her life, and hope that she could finally carve out a path forward, one step at a time. The first few days after the court hearing were filled with a sense of overwhelming relief. She could finally breathe without the constant weight of the looming legal battle. But that relief was short-lived. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to feel the weight of the financial strain again. The child support payments were going to be a challenge to meet, and the cost of living in their town was high. Sarah had taken on a second job at a cafe, working nights to make ends meet, but the long hours and physical exhaustion were taking a toll on her. She had no choice but to keep pushing forward. There was no other option. For the sake of her kids, she had to keep going. In the quiet moments, when the kids were asleep and Sarah was alone in her thoughts, the anger would creep back in. She thought about the years she had sacrificed, about how she had put her own dreams on hold to be a mother, to care for the children, to make sure everything at home ran smoothly. She had trusted Tom, believed that they were a team, and now it felt as though she had been left to pick up the pieces of a broken system. How had he managed to build such a cushion for himself while she was left scrambling to survive? How had she missed the signs? The more she reflected, the more it became clear. Tom hadn't just hidden his finances from her. He had hidden his true self. The person she thought she knew had never truly existed. The person she had once trusted was now someone she couldn't recognize, and that hurt more than anything. But then there were the moments that reminded her of why she had fought so hard. Sophie and Jake, her children, were her anchor. They were the reason she kept moving forward, even on the days when it felt impossible. Sarah found herself focusing on them more than ever. She was more present with them now, spending every moment she could outside of work cherishing their time together. Despite everything that had happened, despite the tension and the changes, Sarah could see the love in their eyes. They were still her children, and she was still their mother. No matter how hard things got, that bond remained unshaken. It was what gave her the strength to keep going. As time passed, Sarah's life began to settle into a new routine. She continued working her second job, but she also started to focus on herself more. She enrolled in an online course to finish her degree, something she had put on hold years ago when she had decided to stay home and care for the kids. It was a small step, but it felt like a giant leap toward reclaiming her sense of independence. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she was doing something for herself, not just for her children, not just for her ex-husband, but for her own future. It was a reminder that, no matter what, she was still capable of building a life of her own. Slowly, things began to change. But change didn't come without challenges. There were days when Sarah felt like she was barely keeping it all together. Her body ached from the long hours, and there were nights when sleep felt like an impossible luxury. Her financial situation remained tight, and she had moments where she questioned whether she could make it through. But then she would look at Sophie and Jake, and the doubts would fade away. She had to keep going, for them, for herself. She was their mother, and that meant she had the strength to face anything. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always clear. But Sarah had learned something in the months since the court hearing. She could survive this, and she would. Tom, on the other hand, seemed unchanged by the ordeal. He continued with his life, his business growing, and his wealth increasing. There was no sign of guilt or remorse in him. If anything, he was more distant than ever, focusing on his work and his own future. He had gotten what he wanted, a favorable ruling in court, a comfortable financial situation, and a life that continued on without disruption. To Sarah, it felt like nothing had ever truly been at stake for him. He hadn't seemed to struggle with the changes. He hadn't questioned his role in the marriage, in the divorce, or in the lives of their children. It was as though, in his mind, everything was as it should be. But despite his indifference, Sarah had made her peace. She no longer allowed his actions or his detachment to consume her. The anger had faded over time, replaced by a quiet acceptance of what was. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't control what Tom did or didn't do. But she could control her own actions. She could make choices that would shape her future, choices that would impact her children's lives in a positive way. And that was what mattered. One day, while Sarah was walking through the park with Sophie and Jake, she noticed something, a simple, yet profound moment that would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was a small scene, one of those moments that would have gone unnoticed by most people. But for Sarah, it was everything. Sophie was laughing as she ran ahead, chasing after a butterfly, while Jake stopped to pick a flower for her. Sarah watched as they interacted, their innocence and joy palpable. In that moment, she realized that no matter what had happened between her and Tom, no matter the struggles she had faced or the battles she had fought, she was still their mother, and that would always be enough. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, and more moments of doubt. But Sarah knew that, no matter what, she had already proven something to herself. She had survived. She had faced the hardest moments of her life and had kept moving forward. And as long as she had her children by her side, she would keep moving forward, one step at a time. The future was still unwritten, but Sarah had found something more powerful than any victory in a courtroom: the strength to embrace the unknown and the courage to rebuild her life, brick by brick. In the end, she realized that the most important thing she had was her ability to keep going, no matter the odds. And that was the greatest victory of all. As Sarah moved forward in the months following the court ruling, a sense of gradual transformation began to take root within her. The anger and confusion that had once dominated her days were slowly being replaced with a more steady, grounded sense of self. She had navigated the storm of her divorce, and though the financial challenges remained, she had learned to weather them with more resilience than she had ever thought possible. Each small victory, Whether it was a moment of calm with her children or a milestone in her pursuit of further education, felt like a triumph. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to thrive, and that realization brought her a quiet kind of peace. The months turned into a year, and Sarah found herself settling into a routine that felt less like a struggle and more like a conscious effort to build a future. The second job at the cafe had become a rhythm she could manage, and though it was tiring, it offered her an independence she hadn't had in years. It wasn't just the extra income that made the job valuable to her. It was the sense of agency that came with earning on her own terms, something she had never fully realized she had been missing during her marriage. For the first time in a long time, Sarah wasn't dependent on anyone but herself, and that realization was both liberating and empowering. But the path to healing was not without its setbacks. There were moments when the weight of the child support payments would feel too heavy, and she would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she was going to make it all work. Her lawyer had assured her that over time, the financial strain would lessen, but there were days when it felt impossible to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And then there were the occasional phone calls or messages from Tom. Short, impersonal communications that carried a sense of distance. He had become even more removed from the family, barely involved in the children's day-to-day lives, which only added to Sarah's sense of bitterness. But she had learned to block out the noise. He was no longer her concern. She had her children to focus on, and everything else seemed secondary now. Her relationship with Sophie and Jake grew stronger as they continued to adapt to their new reality. It wasn't always easy. The kids, especially Jake, still struggled with the changes in their family dynamics. There were moments when Sarah would find Jake sitting by the window, staring out at the street, and she would know instantly that he was thinking about his father. She had tried to explain the situation to them as gently as possible, but there were no simple answers. Divorce, she had come to learn, was never a clean break, especially when children were involved. It was a process, a slow, ongoing healing, and Sarah did her best to reassure them that no matter what, they were a family, and she would always be there for them. They had a new family dynamic now, and it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that gave her a sense of peace. One evening, as the kids settled in for bed, Sarah took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. She thought back to the days when she had first received the court ruling and how everything had felt so overwhelming. There had been times when she questioned her ability to cope with the reality of her situation, but now, with each passing day, she had built a sense of strength and resilience she hadn't known she had. She could see it in her children's eyes, in their smiles, in the way they interacted with her. They were adjusting, growing, and thriving in their own ways, and she was so proud of them. They had endured more than any child should have to, but they were becoming stronger for it. And Sarah, too, was becoming stronger. Yet, despite the progress she had made, Sarah still felt the lingering presence of the emotional toll her marriage and divorce had taken on her. She hadn't been able to shake the sense of betrayal, the feeling that she had given so much of herself to a marriage that had slowly unraveled without her even realizing it. She still wondered what she could have done differently, what signs she might have missed. But each time the doubt crept in, she reminded herself that she had done her best. She had given everything she had to her family. And sometimes, no matter how much you give, things just don't turn out the way you hoped. The important thing, she realized, was that she had kept moving forward. In the quiet moments, Sarah would often find herself thinking about the future. What would it look like? Where would she be in 5 years? 10 years? She had spent so much of her life focusing on the needs of others, on the needs of her family, that she had put her own dreams aside. Now, with the weight of the past finally starting to lift, she found herself beginning to think about what she wanted for herself. She had always dreamed of returning to school, of advancing in her career, but those dreams had seemed so far out of reach during her marriage. Now, as she worked on finishing her degree, she began to feel a renewed sense of possibility. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was determined to take the steps necessary to build the future she had always envisioned for herself. It was around this time that Sarah had an unexpected conversation with her best friend Laura. They had been talking about life, about the ups and downs, and somehow the conversation turned to Sarah's divorce. Laura had always been there for her, offering support and encouragement when Sarah needed it the most. But this time, there was something different in the way Laura spoke to her. "Sarah, I've been thinking," Laura said gently, her eyes soft with concern. "You've been through so much. I've seen you grow in ways I didn't think were possible. You're not the same person you were a year ago. You've done more than just survive. You've learned to rebuild." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She hadn't realized just how much her journey had changed her until someone else pointed it out. She had been so focused on surviving, on making sure that everything was okay for her kids, that she hadn't taken the time to truly reflect on the transformation she had undergone. "Do you ever think about what you want to do next?" Laura asked. "Not just for your kids, but for you. What are your dreams, Sarah? What's your next step?" Sarah was silent for a moment, the question lingering in the air. Her next step. She had been so consumed with getting through the day-to-day challenges of life that she hadn't fully stopped to think about where she was headed. But as she considered the question, something stirred within her. The possibilities felt endless. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop living for the past and start living for the future. The future she was finally beginning to shape for herself. As Sarah looked toward the future, she knew that there would be more challenges ahead. Life was never without its obstacles, but she also knew that she had already faced the hardest moments of her life and had emerged stronger because of them. She wasn't the same person who had walked into the courtroom a year ago, unsure of her future. Now she was someone who had rebuilt her life, piece by piece, and who had the strength and determination to continue doing so. The journey wasn't over yet, but Sarah had learned one of life's most important lessons. No matter what happened, she could always start again. And this time, she was ready. The future was hers to create, and she was no longer afraid to embrace it.